Hi, this is Dr. Frank Topatini with the Church of Rational Truth. Today we're going to talk about another kind of morbid subject. I know last week we talked about suicidality, but today we're going to talk a little bit about death and what happens when people die. It is a sad topic. It is a difficult topic for a lot of people to talk about, but I do think it's important. It's one that people have a lot of questions about. So I figured I'd share a little bit from my experiences and a little bit about, what happens, just so people are knowledgeable. So the first thing is probably that death isn't always an instantaneous process. A lot of people think that dying is just you're alive and then all of a sudden you're dead. But for the most people, that's not really how it happens. It usually is more of a process. Sometimes it can take hours or days for someone to die. It's not as simple as just 1 minute they're alive, 1 minute they're dead. I mean, a lot of movies show it that way, that someone's there completely with it, and then they just kind of pass away. But in reality, what happens is it is a part by part process. Little bits of someone dies or someone moves closer and closer to death. And as they do, parts of them start dying. It's really not just, oh gosh, they're dead. It is usually parts of their body start shutting down, usually organ systems. And the most important part of death is when the brain dies. And that doesn't happen all at once. It's usually a slow process of parts of the brain dying. Usually people become more and more confused. They get more and more comatose to the point where they cannot respond. And as their brain starts shutting down because of lack of oxygen, they start going into agonal breathing because of the areas that control their breathing start dying. They start, making these gasps for breath, or they have this kind of open mouthed breathing, and then shortly after that, they stop breathing. But it's really hard to pinpoint, when exactly does someone die, because it is a process. It's funny, if you actually have spent a lot of time around either hospice or around people in the ICU, their hearts will continue beating even though their brain has died or they've completely stopped breathing. It's because the heart is still kind of living on despite them having died. A lot of times you can watch, if someone is, this is going to be very morbid, if someone is on a monitor where it's, keeping their heartbeat, on TV, you'll see, oh, they stop talking, they slump down, and then all of a sudden you get a flat line in their heart. In reality, that's not traditionally how it happens, or not always how it happens. A lot of times the person will, be not talking, slumped over, comatose for a long time, gasping for breath. Their breathing will stop. They'll have no brain waves, but their heart might continue beating for an amount of time because dying is a process. The organs die at different times. The heart still might have enough to continue beating on for minutes. I mean, in rare cases, much longer than that, even though the person may be legally brain dead. And this is why we have the distinction with brain death and regular death. Usually, death is defined as no heartbeat for over a minute, something like that, no breaths for several minutes. But it's not always that distinct. It is something where someone can be brain dead but still have their heart beating. They can have their heart die, but their brain's still technically working. It doesn't all have to happen at once. The way someone dies is usually because of lack of oxygen to the organs or the tissues, not just lack of oxygen, but it's also a lack of being able to remove the byproducts of metabolism. So everything that's alive has to function, it has to burn oxygen, it has to create waste, and it has to get rid of that waste. So if something is not able to get new oxygen, it's not able to keep its cellular activities working. And if something is not able to get rid of its waste product, it can't get rid of the acid buildup. It can't get rid of all the damaging chemicals that will cease it from functioning. And so it will eventually die and the cells will break down and no longer be able to continue their function. A lot of people think it's just lack of oxygen, but it's not just that. Like, if someone can still get blood flow even in low oxygen circumstances, some tissues can still continue to survive. Not for very, very long. Usually lack of oxygen will damage them, but a lot of times not being able to get rid of their waste products will also cause them to die. One of the things that sometimes doctors try to do when someone is on the brink of death is to slow the metabolism. They do a cooling protocol for a lot of people who have had a cardiac arrest. Basically, their heart has stopped. It has not been pumping blood. what they'll do is they'll many times, and this is kind of like a last ditch effort to try and save someone as much damage as possible from having as much brain damage as possible, is they will cool that person. They will chill them down to near freezing temperatures, and that is an attempt to try to slow down those cellular metabolism, or slow down that cellular metabolism, so that the cells are not functioning, they're not making waste products, they're not getting damaged by this lack of oxygen because of the lack of blood flow. And it has shown some improvement. It's not an amazing improvement, but it is something that many times people will do if someone is in post cardiac arrest and they're trying to bring them back. Another thing is complete circulatory collapse, meaning not having any blood pressure, is technically death, but people can be brought back from that. I have brought people back from the dead several times. Basically, whenever you're running a code on someone, or whenever you see someone on TV that is coded, that person is legally dead. Their heart is not beating. They are not pumping blood to their brain. And even though they are dead, they can still be brought back. And mostly because the tissues are not completely dead. Their brain has not completely died yet. It just cannot function because it's under the amount of oxygen needed to sustain life. So they are passed out, they are non-functioning. But if you can return that blood flow, if you can return that circulation fast enough before enough permanent damage has been done, the person will come back to life. So I would say this is all to kind of teach you that death is a process, that it's not always instantaneous, and people can come back from death in limited circumstances. People often ask too, the next question is, what happens as you die? What happens after you die? We know a good amount about during death. A lot of times people can still maintain a lot of their senses. Sometimes they can still hear, sometimes still process things. Because it depends on what portions of their brain have died or are dying. But after death, there's a big old mystery. I would say we probably do not know exactly what happens after death. Many people believe that there's a heaven and hell, or an afterlife. Many people believe that there's reincarnation, but there's very little or no proof about these things. Most people just have, written documents of, oh, I think this is, it's something where you can have an opinion, but there's really not any good way of proving it. Most of the people who have come back, they do have some near-death experiences, or some experiences around death where they either see light or see stuff flashing before their eyes, or have an out-of-body experience. But many of these things can be recreated. They can just be recreated by depriving the brain of oxygen. So a lot of people who have gone through high G-force testing have had near-death experiences, because you're kind of recreating that lack of oxygen to the brain, and a lot of them have very similar symptoms. If you ever look up, probably on YouTube or somewhere else, near-death experiences and flight training or high G testing, those people will have the same experience as someone who's near death. So it seems like it's not necessarily a spiritual or out of this world phenomenon, but a physical phenomenon that is just related with oxygen deprivation, or depriving the brain of blood flow. So it's hard to say whether those are actual real spiritual experiences, or if it's just a physiologic experience the brain has because it's just not getting the oxygen it needs. People who have been brought back have all sorts of stories, but honestly, they all sound either similar due to that lack of oxygen, or are really just personal experiences, and not really anything that's very definitive of what does happen after death. There's lots of people have opinions, but I would say the actual hard evidence, or things that can physically be proven, which is what we care about the most, is incredibly limited. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't research it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't ask more questions and try and prove what does happen. But I would say most likely it's something similar to when we go to sleep, when we're not dreaming. When we sleep, there is a period where our conscious mind is not active, and we are not aware of what's going on, and there is nothingness. And I would say that's probably the closest we experience to death. But that is also an opinion. I have no way of proving whether that is actually what happens after death, but that is a state where our conscious mind is ceasing to exist. Now, we do have dreaming that happens after that, but we can prove what dreaming is. We can see the waves in our brain that happen during that. And we have some idea of that, but that is clearly different from death, and it clearly has a rational explanation. So hopefully we do end up doing more testing. We dive more into that with research and try and get some better answers, but it's also something that it's going to be kind of hard to find a real answer. It's not going to be easy to prove definitively what happens after death. And, most of us will at some point actually find out, but the sad thing is no one is really going to be coming back to let us know. So if you all have any comments, anything that you all would like to discuss, or any topics you'd like us to do in future videos, please let us know in the comments. This is once again Dr. Frank. Hopefully next week we can have a less grim discussion. Thank you all for tuning in. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.